Well, hello, friends, neighbors. John, your whiskey neighbor here. Welcome down the Nook. It's Sunday, so I'm going to shoot a couple of samples. One of them is a bourbon. The other is some homemade cherry liqueur. So it'll be a unique ride today. If you've got any bourbon or bourbon that's infused with fruit, which is a little bit harder to find, but that'll kind of be the story that we're going to try to tell today. And we're going to focus on this one. This is from Traverse City. A younger distillery putting out some interesting craft bourbons, and this is a barrel proof bourbon, but it has been infused with cherries. So if you have any bourbon that's infused with something like that, why don't you pour it a little bit? When you come back, we'll talk that, and then I'll also compare it to some homemade Polish cherry liqueur. Could be a good ride. See you in a bit. 3, 4. Thanks for staying with me. A couple weeks back, I received a gift pack from Chris in Ontario, who went down to Traverse City and found this bar distillery and bought a sample pack. It's got a bourbon and a rye, and then this bourbon that's infused with cherries, and it's all barrel proof. It's a pretty interesting story. Oh, what are the name of the three people that started? Chris, Jared, and Monty, maybe. And there's a pretty cool story. I suggest that you check out Traverse City online and learn their story from their site and the way they tell it. It's pretty cool. But one of their signature releases is apparently this, right? Where they harvest fresh cherries in the area, and they, I don't know if they steep it, like, because it says infused. I don't know if it says, no, I'm not sure. But it definitely, they definitely have cherries in the bourbon for some time. I think after the bourbon has aged, and then they recask it or re-vat it with cherries. Let's see what this is like. Oh, and it's a pretty big proof. I think it's, yeah, this is batch 1, and it's 54.7% ABV. Bourbon with cherries on the nose. Boy, that's a nice nose. I should have poured a little bit of their regular just compare it to, but it is nice. Sweet, sure, it's pungent. It's 54 or so percent, but it is some cinnamon, some brown sugars, some almost honeys. Like it's sweet. I don't know if I'd get cherry on the nose. I suppose when I think of fruit, now part of that's mental or whatever you want to call it, suggestion, because I know there's cherry in here. But it's sweet like maraschino cherry on the nose. So on the nose, it's got a lot of bourbon richness and then a sweetness of maraschino cherry. Let's try it on the palate. Cheers. It's pretty good. The cherry influence for me really comes across in the palate. If I recall the bourbon, and I should have poured a comparison dram, it was a little more on the savory, on the spicy, on the oaky side. And I have all of that. Some good spices, a bit of cracked pepper, some cinnamons, and then some cooked down brown sugars, and that savory side of bourbon. With this, though, they really have infused a cherry spirit or a cherry influence. It now, I could say it's a little richer, fuller cherry, but it actually kind of still reminds me of, not so packaged and whatever and sweet as maraschino, but something like that, like a sweet, syrupy, thick cherry in with some savory bourbon. So it's actually quite tasty. I'll try another sip. Cherry for me becomes even more pronounced with the second sip. It's strong. This needs a little bit of water. But it now I've really got a bourbon hug with a sweetness of cherry. It almost is like an old fashioned, if you put a lot of cherries in that. Some people do. But you don't, and you pour a little bit of that maraschino cherry juice in there. In that, I'm really getting that type of fruiting here. There's also others. There's echoes now of some apple, even some cooked apple. So there's other layers of fruit there, but really it does become, on the second sip, And I just tried it for the first time. Really about that interplay between a strong bourbon and some nice cherry influence. Pretty cool. And thanks again, Chris, for sending that sample my way. I don't rate samples, but I think I'd enjoy that. I'll probably need to try it with a little bit of water. The next item up here for sampling is a cherry liqueur, or well, I think it's a homemade Polish sour cherry. Nalewka, perhaps? Anyways, it's made entirely from sour cherries. As I understand it, from sour cherries pretty close to me here in Edmonton or just outside of Edmonton, but it's sent to me from Ray in BC. He sent a variety of samples and then said, maybe you should try this. Certainly, the color looks like cherries, so that's kind of interesting. It's not a whiskey. It's not like a bourbon that then has an infusion of cherry kind of let there steep like a cherry tea bag in there, but instead this is made from cherries, I think 100%, and I have no idea proof or even what it tastes like. So I'm going to give this homemade cherry liqueur a try. It's kind of an interesting nose. I definitely would say that kind of sour cherry, but it's a little bit more almost fermented nose than I expected. I was thinking really sweet, like a brandied, sugared sweetness, but it's it's got a little fermented backbone on the palate. Cheers. Wow. So when I talk about a cherry sweetness or a fruit sweetness in whiskey, I should probably pour some of this, because this now in the mouth is like cherry syrup. It is sweet, coating sweet. My first thought is I should pour this over a nice dessert or some nice ice cream. I think it would be a really nice flavor and give it some backbone. It was far too sweet for me to just enjoy in a Glencairn like this, but it's quite tasty and it's certainly well done. I could see why this would be a little bit of an after in a very small glass, a little, what do you call that, aperitif or whatever that is after a meal, and it's really almost like like a shot of espresso. It's a shot of something very sweet and dessert. Like, it's quite nice. It's not a whiskey, but thank you, Ray, for sending it my way. Sorry it took so long for me to compare. Since I've put it in this context, I have to say these share a backbone. There are echoes of cherry, of course, in here, but this, I suggest, is actually a bourbon first with an infusion of some cherry flavor that is pulling out of real local harvested cherries. It's not flavored. I just want to say this is a bourbon first and this is a cherry liqueur first. What a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me here on this Sunday. Hope you've had a great weekend, and I hope the work week up front is pretty good. Take care.